Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, and welcome to SIWI, Swedish Waterhouse, and Sida, the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency's webinar today. My name is Jenny Grönvall, and I will be moderating today's session about greening, or maybe we should say blueing of the human rights, in which we ask, what does the right to a healthy environment mean for water resources? Under the International Universal Human Rights Framework, we are all born with entitlements and freedoms, and these cannot be taken away from us. There is now a new human right, a new instrument in the toolbox for governance and environmental decision-making that has recently been recognized by the United Nations Human Rights Council through Resolution 4813. The right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is essential for the full enjoyment of all human rights and is in particular closely related to and fundamental to the rights to life, food, and health. This new right also has a wider reach than the established rights to safe drinking water and sanitation that were acknowledged in 2010, as it allows for consideration of all water resources, including wastewater, rainwater, soil moisture, fossil groundwater, etc. The right is also of great importance to the protection of ecosystems and biodiversity and nature at large, and for our work with climate change. To us at SIWI, the recognition of the right to a healthy environment is therefore very welcome, as it opens up for addressing how parts of the whole can be connected. Much labor has gone into defining the content and the scope of the right to a healthy environment. And we find guidance in, for instance, the framework principles of 2018, laying down the procedural and substantive obligations that fall primarily on governments of states as duty bearers, and the special obligations towards those most vulnerable that are essential to take a human rights-based approach. But it is yet far from clear precisely what this new right means from a water perspective. And that is why we want to explore why the human right to a healthy environment is necessary, what it adds to this toolbox of already existing human rights, and how it affects the way we work with water resources. On our agenda today, we have an eminent keynote speaker who I will introduce shortly, followed by a panel discussion with equally eminent experts. After a Mentimeter poll, we open up for questions. And please use the Q&A function to ask your questions during the webinar. You can find the housekeeping rules in the chat as well. So for the short keynote presentation on this topic today, we are very happy to have with us Dr. David R. Boyd, an Associate Professor of Law, Policy and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia, previously the Executive Director of Eco-Justice and Special Advisor on Sustainability for the Canadian Prime Minister. David is the current UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, a title that mirrors how this topic was regarded before the right to a healthy environment was recognized. Since his appointment in 2018, he has worked tirelessly to promote a formal recognition of this right. And last year, he also published a report on human rights in the global water crisis, which I encourage you all to check out. But before I hand over to David, I'm happy to give the word to Staffan Smedby, Head of the Unit for Democracy and Human Rights at Sida. Over to you, Staffan.
Thank you, Jenny. Can you hear me all right? Good, excellent. I'm sorry, I was very late into the webinar because I had some obstacles in connecting, and it appears as if I am not Staffan Smedby, but David Limmer, my colleague at Sida. At least it says so on my screen, but I can assure you that my name is Staffan Smedby, and I'm, just as Jenny said, I'm heading the Global Unit for Democracy and Human Rights here at Sida. And I'm very happy to speak on behalf of Sida and just say a few introductory words here at this important event. First of all, a big thank you to SIWI for organizing this seminar, and we certainly look forward to listen to and to learn from the views of David Boyd and all the panelists on what the right to a healthy environment mean for water resources. We at Sida believe that applying a human rights-based approach in the management of freshwater ecosystems, its ecosystem services and biodiversity, is essential to safeguard all water-related human rights and to ensure that no one is left behind. We know how important safe, sufficient water and healthy aquatic ecosystems are for protecting health, achieving food security, and ending poverty, which are all key missions for Sida. At the same time, and equally important, is how we balance different human needs for water while ensuring human rights fulfillment. The right to a healthy environment is especially a critical issue in the water sector, with the health of aquatic ecosystems being one of the key challenges in the years ahead, and critical in achieving several of the Sustainable Development Goals. To reach the Agenda 2030 targets, another important area is strengthening the rights of local communities and indigenous people over water resources and freshwater ecosystem services, as healthy ecosystems are the basis for economic and social development for a majority of these communities. We also see strengthening of national accountability mechanisms in freshwater ecosystems management as a critical step to monitor and disclose social and environmental impacts in freshwater ecosystems. So I look forward to hearing more about all these aspects in today's discussions. And we hope that this seminar today will be the first step in exploring this new human right and how it will help in contributing to every person's right and opportunity to live a decent life. So again, thank you all for participating. I'm very glad to see that there are so many of us here today. Thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I will now hand over to Special Rapporteur David Boyd. So please, David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you, Jenny. And thanks to everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us here today. In my brief allotment of time, I'm going to try and answer 5 questions very quickly. And the first of those questions is the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment a new human right? And the answer to that question is actually no. This right to a healthy environment has actually been part of indigenous legal systems for thousands of years. But from a Western vantage point, it was 1972 in the first Global Environmental Summit in Stockholm, Sweden, where the right to a healthy environment first gained some form of recognition through the Stockholm Declaration. And the right to a healthy environment actually began appearing in national constitutions back in the 1970s, in Portugal in 1976, Spain in 1978, Peru in 1979. At the regional level, this right is actually included in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981, the San Salvador Protocol to the American Convention on Human Rights in 1988, the Aarhus Convention in 1998, the Arab Charter on Human Rights, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 2012. And since I know there are a lot of Europeans in the audience today, let me point out that the only regional human rights system that does not include the right to a healthy environment is the European human rights system, which is quite anomalous given Europe's leadership on human rights and environmental protection. However, I will say that work is ongoing at the Council of Europe to try and fill this gap. And that's something we could talk about in the Q&A session. Today, the right to a healthy environment is legally recognized in more than 80% of UN member states through constitutions, legislation, regional treaties, and court decisions. But there's a kind of interesting paradox here, which is that despite this wide recognition at the national and regional levels, there was until last year no global recognition of the right to a healthy environment. And so perhaps that's what's new, is that there is now a Human Rights Council resolution, as Jenny mentioned, resolution 48/13, adopted on October 8th, 2021, after at least 3 decades of efforts by civil society organizations. And I can tell you, it was a real roller coaster ride, the months of negotiations leading up to that fateful Friday afternoon in October in Geneva. Really went down to the very last minute in the human rights room. But at the end of the day, 43 states voted in favor of the resolution, none voted against, and only 4 abstained: China, Russia, India, and Japan. This initiative was led by a small group of states, including Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland. And those same states are now acting to pursue a similar resolution from the UN General Assembly, hopefully sometime in 2022. The second question that I wanted to address is, what is the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? What is its content? And we have more than 40 years of national and regional experience to draw on, which have clarified that this right has both procedural and substantive components. The procedural components include the right of access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making, such as environmental impact assessments, and access to justice with effective remedies. So that's like the toolkit that comes along with this right. And then the substantive components, which are really critically important, include clean air, safe and sufficient water, stable climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play, and healthy and sustainably produced food. And as Jenny mentioned, the obligations of states are clearly articulated in the framework principles on human rights in the environment, published by my predecessor in 2018. There's also a set of principles which have developed in parallel with the right to a healthy environment, which guide its interpretation and application. And these include prevention, precaution, non-discrimination, and non-regression. So that's the right in a nutshell. And what is the added value of a UN resolution on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? Well, as you all know, we're in the midst of an unprecedented environmental crisis, and recognition of this right is really fundamentally important to protecting human life, human well-being, and human dignity. In my opinion, recognition of this right changes environmental protection from an option to an obligation. As well, this right, as I mentioned earlier, provides comprehensive protection against the full range of environmental harms. And in states that are really leading the way in the implementation of the right to a healthy environment, we see this panoramic approach to sustainability in Costa Rica, Slovenia, France, and other leading nations. And we also see it in judicial interventions where there have been cases around the world based on the right to a healthy environment that have really addressed comprehensive pollution problems. There's a famous case from Argentina called the Mendoza case, which resulted in a Supreme Court of Argentina decision to take a wide range of activities. Governments obligated to take a wide range of activities to clean up the Matanza-Riachuelo River watershed. A similar judicial decision from the Supreme Court of the Philippines about cleaning up pollution in Manila Bay. So this right definitely has implications for the protection of and restoration of water bodies. And I think it's really one key element of the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is its preventive nature. By preventing pollution, by preventing environmental degradation, we actually protect a wide array of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, culture, housing, and an adequate standard of living. And these benefits are particularly important for those who are at most risk of environmental harms, including women, children, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples and local communities, people living in poverty, older persons, migrants, displaced people, and other potentially vulnerable communities. And so if we put this in the context of the 2030 agenda, it really is the people who today are being left the farthest behind, who often shoulder the burdens of environmental degradation. And so the right to a healthy environment should really be, in its implementation, should be prioritized to help those people first. I mentioned earlier that there's 156 nations that recognize this right in law. That means there's 37 UN member states that do not. Interestingly, half of those 37 states are actually small island developing states. So it's not that they don't agree with the right to a healthy environment. In fact, they're strong supporters of it. They just haven't incorporated it into their domestic legal systems yet. And so this resolution of the Human Rights Council should be a spark to clarify and strengthen legal provisions in all states and to prioritize and accelerate actions for implementation. Now, what is the relationship of the right to a healthy environment with other rights? Clearly, the right is closely related to rights like the right to life, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, and the right to an adequate standard of living. And in this way, it's actually quite similar to the rights to water and sanitation, which are also closely related to those other rights. But the right to a healthy environment is unique. As the Inter-American Court has noted, the right to a healthy environment differs from the environmental content that arises from the protection of other rights, such as the right to life. And the Inter-American Court has made it clear that the right to a healthy environment protects ecosystems and biodiversity, both marine and terrestrial. And that's in contrast to what the European Court of Human Rights has said, which has repeatedly stated that, quote, no right to nature preservation is included among the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the European Convention. So that's really critically important from a water perspective, is that the right to a healthy environment protects people's rights to safe drinking water, to sufficient quantities of water, and also to healthy aquatic ecosystems. And the final question I wanted to address is, does recognition of the right to a healthy environment make a positive difference? And again, drawing on decades of experience, we find that the right to a healthy environment is actually a catalyst for a number of really important benefits, including stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation of those laws and policies, higher levels of public participation in environmental decision-making, and reduced environmental injustices. And perhaps the most important conclusion that's been reached by researchers over the past decade is that recognition of the right to a healthy environment contributes to better human rights outcomes through improved environmental performance, including faster reductions in air pollution, faster reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and increased access to safe drinking water. So in conclusion, my friends, just want to say that as you all know, we are embroiled in an unprecedented environmental crisis, the climate crisis, the collapse of biodiversity, the pervasive chemical pollution of our environments. And this has catastrophic consequences for many human rights, the right to a healthy environment, the rights to water and sanitation, and many more. The right to a healthy environment is a very powerful tool that can be used to hold states and businesses accountable. But tools are only effective if people have the knowledge, skills, and capacity to use them. And so I hope that we can work together to use this tool in accelerating the systemic transformations that are needed to achieve the sustainable future that we so desperately desire. And I think conversations like this are helpful in teaching us how to use these tools. So thank you for your time today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, David. That was so inspirational. Truly, it's a call for action to all of us who are here today and everyone who are listening up to the recording afterwards and so on. Thank you so much, and thank you for driving this as a special rapporteur. I know you do this basically 24/7. It's time for our panel now. We have 5 experts with us, and let me present them to you. We have Dr. Annalisa Savaresi, who is, among other things, an associate professor of international environmental law at the University of Eastern Finland and director for Europe at the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. Annalisa is a renowned expert on the interplay between human rights and environmental law. Dr. David Langley is a professor of environmental law at Uppsala University, Sweden. His research, which is often conducted in multidisciplinary collaborations, has touched on a wide range of topics in the fields of environmental law, law of the sea, energy law, and international trade law. David Langley has previously held a share of ocean governance law at Gothenburg University. Amanda Luffen is CEO of the NGO Human Right to Water and is an experienced general manager and business development executive in water, energy, and sustainable development. Her goal is to provide sustainable solutions based on human rights to improve water governance worldwide. Claudia Ituarte Lima is currently a senior researcher at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and is also affiliated with the Stockholm University and the University of British Columbia, Canada. For the past 20 years, she has specialized in human rights, biodiversity, and climate law. Finally, the business community also plays a role in the context we are discussing. And expectations are constantly growing on the private sector to respect human rights. It is therefore a pleasure to have with us Kristina Niemele Ström of IKEA, the Swedish furniture, etc. giant. Kristina is responsible for the IKEA supply sustainability agenda. She is an internationally experienced business leader with a deep understanding of the total IKEA value chain within supply range and franchise for over 20 years. Welcome to you. And I know that David Boyd, you can only stay with us for some time before you have another meeting, and it's very early in Vancouver too. So I'm going to start with a follow-up question to you. You have given us the outline now of what this new, I'm going to put that in brackets very clearly now, right to a healthy and sustainable environment contains. And it's clearly important for us humans of today and of tomorrow, but it does not give nature itself any rights. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because as we haven't discussed about, but there has been this parallel emergence over the past decade or so of recognition of the legal rights of nature in a number of countries, in Ecuador's constitution, in court decisions in Colombia, India, Bangladesh, and other countries. And what's actually really fascinating is that these two concepts, the human right to a healthy environment and the rights of nature, are actually being merged together in leading countries like Mexico, Colombia, and also by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Because what these judges are recognizing, and what we should all recognize, is that humans are a part of nature. We're not separate from nature. We're part of nature, and we all depend on healthy ecosystems, healthy biodiversity, an unpolluted planet, and a safe climate. And so our interests are really one and the same when it comes to human flourishing and long-term sustainability. And therefore, the rights of nature in some ways are human rights as well. And so I think that's quite encouraging to have that recognition, because for too long, humans have seen ourselves as separate from and superior to the natural world. And so to recognize that we are an integral part of ecosystems of nature, and that our interests align from a long-term sustainability perspective, I think is quite an important cultural and legal breakthrough.
Indeed. Yeah, and there is so much happening, and I'm sure we're going to see webinars where the two rights, the human rights and the rights of nature, are treated in one of the same webinar to explore this further. Thank you for that. Anna-Lisa, if we now go a little deeper into the legal nitty-gritty, can you clarify why this right to a healthy environment is strictly seen not legally binding as of yet? Do we have Anna-Lisa? Yes.
Yes, I was struggling to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that question. Now, it's important that we are clear on what we're talking about, because as David said, the right to a healthy environment is already recognized in the law of more than 150 countries, and in some, if not all, regional human rights systems. So it is already the law in those regions and in those states. In fact, in that context, David has done an important work both as special rapporteur and as an academic in analyzing the practice that exists on the implementation of this right and understanding what difference it makes in practice. I don't want to summarize David's work for him, but clearly this right makes a difference in the context of litigation, adjudication, and decision-making, even though its potential is arguably still yet to be fully exploited. And in this regard, I think that the Human Rights Council resolution that David mentioned that was adopted last year is potentially a game changer. Why? Because it highlights that this right should be universally protected, also in those states that don't yet formally recognize it, also in the regions where this is not yet recognized. And we know that there is an ongoing debate in the Council of Europe before the UN General Assembly on this specific matter. But most importantly, when we're talking about the nitty-gritty everyday practice of the law, the wider recognition of the right to a healthy environment can embolden NGOs, groups, individuals to really rely on this right in their claims, in their complaints, in their demands to be heard. And what this right does is to highlight the collective dimension of the fact that we all should be living in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And what does this mean in practice? This means that we have additional tools to use to demand better laws, better law enforcement. And this is really crucial in the context of the multiple environmental crises that David has mentioned.
Thank you, Anna-Lisa. I think that was highlighting well the importance of us all almost being activists, right? to use this resolution, but not the least also use all the work that precedes, all the law, the court orders, the practices all around the world to force changes along with this new right. So thank you. Amanda, we have received some questions in advance of this webinar, and Robert Boss asks this. The human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation have clear targets or substantive criteria: accessibility, availability, quality, acceptability, and affordability. Even limiting the environment to water resources, what are the concrete criteria that are set to be achieved under this new human right to a healthy environment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because it's always nice to kind of box things in and have a system to follow. And I don't think you can look at the environment in that way. It's a much more holistic thing that we're trying to achieve. Everything is interconnected: water and air and biodiversity. We need all of it to work together. You can't just say tick the box and do these things. Interestingly, I mean, that the whole process that we went through to get the human rights to water started with General Comment 15 in 2002, which was a long time before there was a resolution. Maybe not quite as long as the one for the environment. It sounds like it was started many decades before that. But it does require a lot of massaging and discussion and thinking through in terms of how we're going to achieve that. There was actually in General Comment 15 quite a lot of guidance already about the environment and how the right to water sits within the right to a healthy environment, and what we need to be doing to try and improve the environment for everyone. And in actual case, it makes a strong case for looking after both, but we seem to have concentrated more on the impacts on people in terms of the accessibility criteria than we have on the environment. And those have kind of been in the background and almost forgotten, I think. I quite often have a discussion with people about, well, do you support the environment as well? And I can't see how you can separate the two. If I just very quickly run through the obligations that are provided by the committee through that general comment, they include the need to reduce depletion of water supplies, reduce contamination, monitor reserves of water, that development should not interfere with access to water, and that we should assess the impact of any development on all of the aspects of or effects that could happen to the environment through the use of water and effects on water. So water is not the only environmental factor, of course, but it's an important one and central to life. So it is very, without it, we can't have any life. And it's very worrying that we actually need to have gone through this process to get people to understand that, because we are just a tiny piece in the global environment, and without looking after the rest of our environment, there is no water for us. So we can't ignore that connection. So I think in answer to your question, I think that there could be criteria in the same way, but if you just pick 5, it would be not doing justice. And there are other tools and methodologies out there for analysing the environment, such as I've been working with UNECE on their People First PPP evaluation tool, which has a big segment on the environment and what do you need to consider, what standards of air, water, other environmental factors do you need to consider in the development of projects. And so some of the detail can be, it almost needs to be at that level to be meaningful. Having said that, I also think that we need to start off, like we have, with the right to water and make sure that it's in the Constitution. And currently, I think there's only 80% of countries that have actually recognised the right to the environment in any form at the moment. in their legal systems. So there's a lot of work that can be done there. And I think analysis of what are the key aspects that need to be included along the lines of some of the comments that David was saying earlier in his recent paper. There's and the resolution, we can certainly pull out some of the key legal criteria that should be involved, and that would be a useful process to go through.
Thank you very much. I think this is something we definitely need to come back to and discuss further. And indeed, I agree that the general comment number 15 is so important. I myself go back to it regularly because it is so rich, and it is what we use to understand and interpret what the right to safe drinking water means. But indeed, it also does very much discuss the environment as a whole, the sustainability that is needed in order to provide the services of supplying drinking water and sanitation. So thank you. I'm going to move on and ask David Langley another question that came in on beforehand. So your work is very much about the land-sea interaction and governing of inland waters, coasts, and oceans. Why is this important for water resources development and protection, if we start there?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. Well, first of all, of course, it's because inland coasts and marine areas are physically connected in many concrete ways. I mean, polluting substances and nutrients that enter water bodies on land or inland are likely to eventually reach the sea. We have planning measures, infrastructure, and other activities in coastal areas that to a large extent define how humans interact with marine areas and further offshore. And then, of course, we have the issue of demand for ocean resources, such as fish or fossil or renewable energy that can be explored or generated in offshore areas. And that demand is typically determined by policies and economic incentives, habits, etc., that we find on land. So in terms of policy and also in terms of sort of physical connection, it's futile to try to address inland waters, or for that land, any inland activities, coastal activities, and marine activities and human pressures in isolation. That's really bound to fail.
So this is very much systems oriented, really. So here comes the question from the audience. How is this system perspective of importance to the new human rights for a healthy environment? How is it relevant to consider land-based activities upstream and oceans as receivers of externalities when working to guarantee the human rights?
Well, I would say that even before talking about this human right, or even without talking about the human right, I mean, we need to bridge the land-sea divide, because other policies are likely to develop in isolation and they might become incompatible rather than mutually supportive and communicating. There are many synergies in the marine environment that needs to be taken into consideration when we decide on policies for land or upstream or coastal areas. We must also recognize that there may be trade-offs, and also trade-offs between different kinds of rights. And without considering the full spectrum of land, coast, and oceans in decision-making, there is a big risk that the overall outcome in terms of various societal objectives, including the right to a healthy environment, will suffer. So, but I think, I mean, the right can be, as Annalise referred to, it can be a kind of a rallying cry. It can be something for many actors across this divide to gather around, and it can facilitate coordination and sort of the imagination of solutions across these spatial and spatial and temporal scales that are necessary to bridge. But the existence of the right as such does not resolve many of the hard questions about synergies and trade-offs between, for example, protection of biodiversity and deployment of large renewable energy production, etc., or conflicts between cultural rights or more environmentally efficient measures of various kinds. So the right, of course, needs to be added into this dense fabric of legal and policy mechanisms that are already in place. And if it is added in a good way, I think it has much potential to coordinate and to strengthen actors that can have a positive impact in this realm. Yes.
Thanks. And maybe the further we come in interpreting and understanding precisely what is covered, then maybe we can actually ensure to also protect the biodiversity of the seas as much as on the inland, etc. So yeah, I guess time will tell a little bit there. Thank you for now, David Langley. I turn to Claudia now. In which ways can the right to a healthy environment contribute to achieve societal transformations for safeguarding biodiversity? And here we should remember that a human right is per definition human-centered. But then what does the right to a healthy environment mean to biodiversity and ecosystems protection?
Yeah, I think the more we embed intergenerational justice and gender equality in implementing the right to a healthy environment, is the more likely that we will be able to unlock this transformative change for safeguarding biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, including freshwater, coastal areas. And I think we have to do this, and I will highlight two ways of doing it. One is changing the assumption that women, children, and many other groups, but I will highlight this now, in the Global South are passive victims of environmental degradation. They're active agents of change. And we can see it very clearly in the many court cases in which children, women exercising information, participation, and access to justice that, as David mentioned, are key elements of the right to a healthy environment, are making very specific change. And just to give you an example, in 2018, the Supreme Court of Colombia ruled in favor of 25 children and youth living in the Amazon. As you know, the Amazon is a key freshwater biodiversity that is important for culture and many other nature contributions to people. So I think, and in this specific court case, it is recognized obligations towards people, but also other living beings, towards present, but also future generations. And it's reflected in this, what the court says, that it's an ecological constitution. So I think, again, looking at what this inclusive way of understanding the content of the right to a healthy environment, and here also academics from the Global South have a lot to say in how do we bring this inclusive content of the right. So I will leave it like that at the moment, and saying like this is really a two-way process. It's not only that the Human Rights Council of the General Assembly would define what is the content of that right, but also a bottom-up process, and both are interplayed.
Thank you. I have a follow-up there. The right to a healthy environment is of importance to indigenous peoples and linked to their rights and their needs to use natural resources. Do you see any risks for conflict of interests between the realization of the human rights to health, etc., on the one hand, and the measures to protect nature and preserve biodiversity?
I see that very much stress in terms of the tensions between human rights and biodiversity. Personally, I see much more the potential for catalytic change. And this includes many examples in which, again, indigenous people and local communities, although they are most vulnerable in many ways because they depend more directly to these healthy ecosystems, they are also the ones driving this transformative change. And again, with court cases and many other ways in terms of their traditional knowledge. So I think I could frame it as that to start with. Of course, there are certain tensions, and I think partly because the human rights-based approach has not been necessarily embedded in all the actions that we need to when we follow up in this biodiversity conservation. And I mean, just to mention a case, and I think this case makes us think about the extraterritorial obligations, including the European Union and other countries have in terms of the right to a healthy environment. The Water Towers project in Kenya displaced the Sangwar people from their ancestral and didn't recognize their traditional rights, and they were forcibly displaced. This project was being financed by European countries, and it took to the point that people got killed that European countries stopped and suspended funding this project. We don't need to arrive to that. And I think this recognition of the right to a healthy environment and the associated extraterritorial obligations can really help in that way. And I think we're also in a critical moment with the negotiation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that will be deciding the next 10 years of the convention. So we have a critical opportunity to embed this right to healthy environment in this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which again will benefit both people and nature in a very systemic way.
And I have to ask, do you think it's very likely that we will manage to embed the recognition of human rights into the framework post-2020?
Well, I mean, there are, when I started working in this topic 20 years ago, and I brought the issue of the human rights, the Convention of Biological Diversity, it was a complete niche area. People say, no, this is not a human rights treaty. We are a biodiversity treaty. If you want to talk about human rights, go to the Human Rights Council or others. Now, that's not the question. I think there is this acknowledgement, and it's being very much mainstream. You have the Women Caucus, you have Indigenous People Caucus, you have the Youth Caucus, like really pushing very strongly for this right. You have states that are being more and more receptive to this idea. So I think there is a critical window of opportunity. We'll see what happens in the adoption that will take place in Kunming, China, and also thinking about the technical meetings that will proceed. I think those will be very important moments for decision.
Thank you so much. Definitely the participation of representatives of very many different groups will be needed there. Now I'm going to turn to you, Christina. This new right, like all human rights, relates also to the private sector and other so-called non-state actors, as laid down, for instance, in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which IKEA has endorsed. How can your work at IKEA and your work in your capacity there, how can you work on a water positive strategy and water stewardship bring opportunities in supporting a healthy environment and healthy water resources?
I mean, at IKEA, we have this ambition that by 2030, we should indeed be water positive. And of course, being then the good water stewards. And that means that we contribute to increase the water availability and its quality in our operations and in our value chain, everything that is linked to us. So that, of course, means that we need to work to use the water as efficiently as possible and as little as possible, and secure that we are not part of polluting in our areas. And of course, then that would actually harm the people also living there. So, and we are also in many of the water scarce areas. Of course, we need to pay extra attention to that part. So that's part of our own work to secure that we are doing whatever we can. Then we believe in that, has been mentioned by many of the other panelists here, this is a systemic question, yeah? So we need to work with others, both on local and on global levels, what we call in the multi-stakeholder approach. So for instance, now we joined last year the SBTN for Nature, this, what we then call it, the corporate engagement program, where we're then supporting to find what are the science-based targets that we can also put to create this level playing field in the area, so that we can have these science-based targets that we can also follow up and work with, etc. And of course, we know today where we have the biggest pressure on water because of our own operations, and that is within the textile industry, both in the material extraction and the farming, of course, mainly of cotton, and then also in the production. So I think already until today, we've been working very much, maybe not thinking of it as because of this new human right, or maybe as David said before, it's quite old actually. But to secure that in our cotton supply chains, we started already 2007 and 2009, we were a founding member of the Better Cotton Initiative that is aiming to actually reduce pesticides use, fertilizer use, and reduce the water use. And since 2015, that is the only cotton that is approved in the IKEA supply chain. And so far, that is actually saving water with 20% compared to conventional cotton. So of course, that is water that then can be used by people and the communities for their total livelihood, I would say, in that sense. So it's very important that we in the business take our part in this, and we need to continue to learn. So we have also working with NGOs such as WWF, who is one of our main partners, to also continue to work in the cotton field, but also in the water areas, looking into what does it mean for the water basins. We have projects in Turkey and India to see on a higher level, also with the biodiversity question, environmental question, more in a broader way. So linking, of course, into, for instance, cotton farming, you know, to increase more crop for each drop and better yields, etc. And also, I think I would like to mention also before this with the Better Cotton Initiative is also one part to actually have the farmers, many times smallholder farmers, to also earn more. So I think that the livelihood question in this specific was a human right is an important one. And I think that is added when you go beyond the water and sanitation part. So I think that we can work with that, and then that we have our supply, some individual suppliers do fantastic work, but it's not systematic yet. We haven't made it that yet. So we have a potential there. But I mean, when we have suppliers like one in Bangladesh has the first zero discharge plant in the country and saving than 80% of the groundwater, or another supplier in Pakistan who has this water filtering system saving 60%, and 60% is recycled water. So I think that all those things working with water and connecting it to that it is a human right to have a clean and safe and healthy environment is something where we in business are already doing something, but can do much more together with the rest of the stakeholders in this.
Thank you. I have myself done a lot of research in the textile manufacturing, especially in India and Ethiopia, and especially the wet processing stage, of course, where you do the bleaching and the and so on. That is the most water polluting, of course, and so on. So for a company like yours and others, it's of course very important to work both upstreams and then maybe think of the downstream, the end users of your. I'll leave it there and I'll go back to David Langley. So far we have mainly talked about this right as a matter for state governments as duty bearers. But a relevant question is, of course, also what this new right can mean to water resources that are shared between countries, such as a transboundary river or aquifer, and for the cooperation between such countries. For instance, if pollution of a river takes place and this affects residents of a country downstream, does the right to a healthy environment apply, and how can it be of use?
Well, I mean, shared water resources has been a contentious issue for decades, if not centuries. And I mean, first of all, traditionally, downstream actors or downstream states and individuals have not had that much say, really. That is gradually changing, not so much because of the rights perspective, maybe, but because of sort of a maturing of international law and international environmental law, recognizing the need for protecting natural resources also in transboundary contexts. I think that in itself, the existence of a right will not have that much effect. I mean, the importance issue will be, for example, principles of standing and existence of other legal remedies that people can avail themselves of with respect to environmental pressures that originate from other countries than where they reside themselves. So traditionally harm to other countries have been viewed as an interstate matter, so that states need to take action by diplomatic means or in international courts vis-a-vis each other. But then there are, of course, legal orders such as the EU, where we have elements of non-discrimination built into the legal system. And of course, human rights systems and mechanisms can also have this effect. But to be effective, there typically has to be a legal remedy within a national legal system, I would say, that could be that people could avail themselves of, even if they are not citizens or residents of that country themselves. At least in some legal orders, recognizing a clear right to healthy environment will make courts more likely to accept standing for those affected or provide legal remedies, even if those individuals are not residing in the country or citizens of the country. But I think in many cases, the most important effect of this right is that how it can impact our views of the environment and how the environment is intrinsically linked, as we heard here repeatedly, to basic human rights and on a conceptual level. And I mean, when our views and conceptions change, policies and laws on a more sort of practical nitty-gritty level will follow, because that sets motion in traction in the political arena, of course, and politics translates into law and legal reform.
Very good, yes. Impacting on our views, that's what we need, right? That's one of the effects we can clearly see. Now I'll come back to this, but first, David Boyd, do you have a reflection on this with the extraterritorial rights and obligations? And I don't see David Boyd anymore. Let's move on.
David has left. Yes.
Yes, he left the very second I asked that question. That's so strange. Annalisa, I was going to turn to you, so thanks. Do you think we may see judicial and non-judicial complaints based on the right to a healthy environment reaching the courts in the near future?
So, as I mentioned earlier, there is already a body of national case law and practice on the content and scope of the right to a healthy environment. So again, stepping in for David since he's left us, he's done a lot of work mapping this practice and analyzing it. And I think I do justice to his findings when I say that the analysis of this practice shows that when it is applied by the judiciary, the right to a healthy environment can be used to bridge gaps in environmental laws and to provide better access to justice to individuals, groups, civil society organizations that rely on this right to request better legislation and or better implementation and enforcement of existing legislation. So complaints based on the right to a healthy environment are common already in the countries that recognize this right, but are likely to become even more common, I would speculate, amongst others because of this resolution by the Human Rights Council. It's noteworthy that the right to a healthy environment is invoked in litigation, even in countries that don't explicitly recognize such a right. And in recent months and years, we've seen, for example, a spike in the use of this right in climate litigation. I'm sure that many of you have heard about the burgeoning practice that exists on this subject matter. And this is really a clear testimony of domino implications, if you like, of litigation strategies that are replicated in various countries by similar organizations asking similar things, relying on the right to a healthy environment, amongst other things. So what I say is interesting for our purposes here is that the right to a healthy environment can be used to bridge the accountability and enforcement gaps that plague environmental governance and water governance in particular.
I'm writing. This is, yeah, indeed, bridging the enforcement and implementation gap. Another thing that is so necessary. We had a Shell case I judged last year, and that was a big thing indeed. Is there something you would like to mention there? Because of course, then this new right to healthy environment, it didn't formally exist the way it does right now. But the court certainly invoked, for instance, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and human rights in general as well.
The Milieu Defense case you mentioned, that is a decision taken by a Dutch court last year, is a milestone decision for many reasons. First of all, I should say that the case is subject to appeal. and that it doesn't specifically rely on the right to a healthy environment. So we are looking at something a little bit different here, but nevertheless related, because human rights-based climate litigation is on the rise everywhere, but especially in Europe. For the reasons that David mentioned earlier, this litigation doesn't often rely on the right to a healthy environment, but on other rights that are typically used in the environmental litigation, i.e. human rights-based litigation that concerns some environmental objective or interest. Now, the Shell case is important because it's a judicial affirmation that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are justiciable. And this is what has sent some shock waves through the system. It has to be said that that Dutch court reached this conclusion on the basis of various elements of EU law and not only on the guiding principles itself. So there is a big picture there. It's not only the guiding principles, but nevertheless, it's very important what the court said.
Indeed. And as you said, we have not seen the very, very end of that court case yet. But some experts find it quite likely that it will stand, the order against Shell there. And indeed, yeah, okay, you think it's minor. Okay, very interesting. Let's come back to that as well. Claudia, you did mention environmental justice before. In fact, that is something that is very important in your work. I know that Inger Andersen, the executive director of the UN Environment Programme, has said that the adoption of the right to a healthy environment is a breakthrough moment for environmental justice. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. I think we need to be recognizing these more systemic ways in which the local, the global interact, in ways in which also the temporal dimensions, not only today, but present and future generations. And I think this recognition of the right help us in this intergenerational justice. I could say we need to look more at gender equality as one of the strategic entry points on how do we implement this right to a healthy environment. And this intersectionality, because women in the global south, or like we have the case, for instance, of Nemonte Nequimo in Ecuador, that again use the courts, but also together with other tools in order to safeguard a significant part of the Amazon, which, I mean, there are various different countries and these temporal, but also these geographical, for instance, the Amazon being shared by so many countries. So I think we're just starting to see what this systemic approach to the right to a healthy environment means. And I think if we approach that in terms of justice issues, that I think it's something that as lawyers, we need to be thinking more systemic as opposed to trying to see a direct only cause and effect. We're more likely really to be thinking in terms of how the Anthropocene, this idea that humans are the driving force of and shaping nature, and at the same time are completely dependent on nature. I think it's really going to take us to really think about these concepts, but in a way that leaves no one behind.
Great. Can I just ask you, for those who aren't familiar with the word intersectionality, can you just say what that means?
Yeah, so we're thinking in terms of, for instance, to be talking about gender equality. It's not exactly the same if we're talking about it in Europe or if we're talking about it in, say, a global south country, where the main issue, for instance, for women, if we relate it to the right to water, maybe to have land rights formally recognized. Why? Well, because otherwise they cannot exercise the right to information, participation, access to justice. And because they are, in many cases, the main responsible for fetching water, women and girls. So understanding, for instance, if we're talking about gender equality, to understand that it's about what's the age of that person, where is that person living, and these intersecting forms of both inequalities but also capabilities to enact change.
Great, thank you. Amanda, with regards very much to future generations, but of course also to all of us who are living here today, how do you work, how will you work, and how can the right to a healthy environment be used as a tool to strengthen the human rights to water? And yeah, how can you, as an organization such as yours, maybe an organization such as SIWI, work to back this new right, to push it, to ensure that we go from words to implementation to practice?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really see the right to environment as really helping with the right to water, because it's an almost formidable task in a lot of developing countries to find enough good quality water for people who are in marginalized areas. And a much more, I think that said earlier, holistic approach to the environment is what's needed for our water resources. So being able to actually connect the environment with human rights is a really big thing, because actually now we have another tool at our disposal that we can use to persuade states to strengthen their laws and policies and regulations. So one of the ways we work is by mapping the law and policies in a country to see how well they've integrated the human rights to water and sanitation, and that can be done in a systematized way to actually benchmark how well the country is integrating those laws. And from that, you can actually use it as a way of comparing notes and learning and helping to give advice and recommendations on how to improve things. I think we could do a lot by integrating that with the right to the environment, to a healthy environment as well, and really think about how we could strengthen that to create a tool that would actually start to provide a backbone for how we could systematize integration of the human rights. It's just another approach. It's not by any means the whole story, but it could be one way.
Very, very good. And do you think that the countries that you work with, will they find this as just an additional burden on themselves, or will they, which I hope, see this as something that just recognizes the entire lot of what they are doing, rather than maybe only the drinking water supply measures?
Well, it very much depends on the country, but the ones that we work with the most are the ones that are really trying hard to do something, and they're looking for advice, because actually it's difficult. So having a system that gives some advice on, here are some ideas for how you could integrate this into your constitution, laws, policies, that could actually improve things. And I'm not talking about environmental standards here, I'm talking about the human rights-based approach mostly, and making sure that people are involved and vulnerable people are not forgotten, and that the processes are there to make sure that they're included in the supply of water or whatever.
Great, keep up that good work. And Christina, at IKEA, how do you work? How do you intend to work? Are you changing anything because we now have this formal recognition of the right to a healthy environment?
I mean, we are committed to live up.
Of course.
We are of course committed to live up to our responsibility towards the UNGPs for business and human rights, and now we need to then include also these new human rights, so to say. And we see that this human rights to a healthy environment can also be strengthening the activities and things we do already within the environmental field, and such as climate initiatives, biodiversity initiatives. And when we add this into it, that we can actually see those synergies, they go more in the same line than actually they go in opposition. So we think that we can actually use this to have better results in a more overall landscape as such. And what we have done then last year is to do in general a human rights baseline assessment. How do our company business processes and decision-making setups, how do they actually strengthen that we can implement and integrate the human rights in our full supply chain and value chain where we work. And now we need to do the same with this one and see what would it take from us. And I mean, we talked a lot here about governments and countries being responsible. And some are taking it more than others and some are not, but we're a business who have a global footprint and we need to do this wherever we are. So this will take, I think we will learn a lot. We have to revise some of our processes and the way we actually decide, and we need to do it rather sooner than later, because we want to be a positive force in the societies where we're active, because we also say we want to be people and planet positive in general. So I see this as a big both opportunity, but also responsibility for IKEA to do. And we're committed to do that. And here we need to work together with the people maybe in this call, NGOs, other businesses as well, and work with, just as late as yesterday, you know, there was a UN treaty suggested with 70 different signatories to actually have a global view against pollution of waters, and of course clearing very much about the plastic pollutants, of course, both in oceans and in fresh water. So we signed that to also learn and see some pressure also and get, you know, all of us working in the same direction, because then we are stronger. These are not topics we can solve alone. We need to work all of us together in this.
And very, very briefly, do you think that you will also be held to account to another degree now that we have an additional formal right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that also with the due diligence within the area of human rights is also helping. It will kind of move all the different topics in a more future-proof and people-proof direction, because this is something where we all have a say, and we also have to do our utmost to contribute.
Very good. We're hoping for that. Now, Anna-Lisa, last but not least, a question for you then. The right to a healthy environment needs to be implemented. We've spoken a little bit about that. We need practical steps and means. We need collaboration. We need to see a lot of government action. Can you say something brief about this?
Sure. As you just said, there is widespread agreement that developing a rights-based approach to environmental decision-making is very necessary. What this means in practice, however, is complicated. David Langley earlier mentioned that there are trade-offs, and indeed, even more so, I would say, in the context of the transition away from fossil fuel-based societies towards net zero emissions. I think that many, but perhaps not everyone, realizes how revolutionary that requires us to be. We have to change everything if we want to get to net zero by 2050. And this means that we really need to really think very hard what having a human rights-based approach to environmental decision-making entails. And this is because there will be losers along the way, and we really need all the gamut of human rights law, and specifically the right to a healthy environment, to shine the path ahead of us. We really need to use it as a compass to signal where there are collective interests beyond the individual and the way we need to go, because many times individual complaints about human rights violations are dismissed as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. I don't want a wind farm near my home. I don't want a biomass plant. But you know, the right to a healthy environment can really be used in that context to understand where there are collective instances that need to be addressed. And we have also a new human rights and special rapporteur on human rights and climate change that will be helping us to identify solutions to these trade-offs and how a rights-based approach, amongst others, to climate action should be developed.
Thank you so much for that, Anna-Lisa. And indeed, a new special rapporteur that is dedicated to the climate change issues. Well, I'm not going to say it was long overdue, but we are very, very grateful that there will be such a person. And I'm sure that David Boyd, Pedro Argudo, who's the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights, Water and Sanitation, and other Special Rapporteurs will work very closely together, as they always do. And now there's one more person who can drive this. Thank you very much to the panel for now. I'm going to ask Malin to run a Mentimeter question for us all.
Yes, thank you, Jenny, and thank you, the panelists, for this very interesting discussion. And as Jenny said, I'm now turning to the audience of the webinar to start a Mentimeter energizer. Here we go. Yes, so please bring up your phones or your computer browser and go into menti.com and type in the code 12693296, which you can see here on the screen. This is a very wide and open question. For whom do you believe the human right to a healthy environment matters the most? So just answer what comes to your mind when you think of this right. We have some answers: vulnerable communities, marginalized, future generations, indigenous communities, non-human species, and the poorest, ecosystems, also including nature. I will give you all some more minutes to think and answer this. Yes, we can definitely see some themes. Future generations, everyone, all living beings, youth, ecosystems, environmental activisms also. Yes, and it's evident that this new right is something that concerns a lot of people. Jenny, should I turn over to you now? Thank you all for sending in your answers to this Mentimeter.
Beautiful. I really love the colors there and the background. Well done, everyone. So everyone and future generations, I think we have on top, but with very many other very deserving groups as well listed. So thanks for participating in this. I certainly think all of those, indeed. We are going to go to questions now. We have some in the Q&A. I'm going to start with one from Laila Mehta. And this one, I believe, I think Amanda can respond to. It is striking how broad and comprehensive the substantive issues covered by the right to a healthy environment are compared with the right to water, which is even narrower than what was laid out in General Comment number 15. Indeed, in practice, it is very much more narrow than what is laid out in General Comment number 15. So one, there may be trade-offs, challenges and dilutions in terms of executing this right. For instance, climate change impacts, pandemic impacts, toxic pollution, implications for water resources, etc. I'm not sure. I don't think there's a question there really. I also wonder whether the right to water should actually be expanded to consider environmental, food security, and livelihood aspects which are missing in the right to water. This is something I've been working on for a while, especially given the implications of land grabs, food insecurity, etc., and the inability of the right to water to address these issues. And if any of the panelists know why the first Special Rapporteur took such a narrow interpretation of the right to water, I'd be really interested to hear more. And Amanda, indeed, I think you know some of the answers to this.
I don't know that I can only give you my opinion on this, but my guess is the right to water was quite a significant new thing when it first was approved by the UN, and people didn't understand what it really meant, and so it needed to be simplified. And a lot of work was done to translate a document that was really legalese and complicated into 5 criteria for the right, and also the 5 principles of the human rights-based approach. And it works. But even with those criteria, people still don't really know what it means. What do you mean by accessibility to water? And how does that translate into local law, and how does that really impact people? And so I think that by necessity, its success in implementing was also oversimplification, and then created maybe a simplistic approach. But without that, I don't think we've got anywhere. And then if you look at the SDGs, SDG 6 with the target goals, that absolutely encapsulates it and enables some kind of benchmarking to be done. So I think it has been oversimplified. You can't do that with the environment in the same way. And I think that when you look at the framework principles, they're all about the process and the need to protect, respect, and human rights, and giving people the right to speak up and not be vilified for it, and to make sure people have access to information and participate in decision making. So it's about the process. But actually, at the end, there needs to be somebody who sets the environmental standards as well. But that's not what the human right is about. The human right is about making sure we have that right to the healthy environment, and then we need the experts to help us to make that happen. So I didn't answer the question very well, I don't think, because it isn't a yes/no answer. There has been an oversimplification, but as I said earlier in my presentation, there also was a lot of mention about the link with the healthy environment in comment number 15, and to a large extent it was submerged by the simplicity that we ended up with the criteria. And so I think that there is still scope to use that to help to build up some standards. And I think that the right to a healthy environment will help with the right to water as well, because it's giving more voice and giving us more it's actually more solution based in terms of looking at the water resources. What can we do to actually create more good quality water for people?
Thanks, Amanda. And a short reflection from my own side is that if you go back and scrutinize some of the documents that led up to the voting on the right to water and sanitation, it was just one right back then. You can see that countries such as my own Sweden and Canada were very, very worried about the far-reaching obligations that they read into this new right. They thought that, oh, now they would have to start, for instance, Canada would need to start serving US populations across the border with water. They would basically need to build pipelines and just distribute water to there. And so I think the oversimplification and the narrowing down was very much in response to such misinterpretations of what was the actual meaning behind that those rights back then, and therefore we have the situation now where we very much need the expansion and the widened reach that the right to a healthy environment provides us. And indeed, as I said before, the general comment number 15, it provides a lot of the interpretation scope that we need to understand and interpret what this new right provides us. But beyond that, there is much more work to be done. Claudia, maybe you also have something to say, because you also worked behind the scenes with David Boyd in the lead up a few years back when some of the work was done that we now see the result of.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a balance to, I mean, as lawyers, we always want to have everything clear. And I mean, we put clarity and certainty and these kind of issues as a paramount. However, if we take a systemic approach on sustainability science, it's in terms of certainty, what we are looking for is also flexibility. And then how do we balance both? And I think another question that came into the chat was this idea of preventive action and risk reduction. So I think as mentioned by David, I think something that it's really important that the human right to a healthy environment is bringing is this interdependency, that I think it's where these two strands meet. This interdependency, not only in terms of looking at civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights, but looking at the interdependency between human rights and healthy environment. And I think these interconnections also between the different elements of the right to a healthy environment in terms of, for instance, healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, I think this is a core issue that wasn't there before. And I think embedding this ecosystems approach for preventive action, it's also one of the key issues that is bringing us new. And again, in terms of the other question that was raised in the chat, I mean, this risk reduction comes to very concrete tools that we have in the environmental field, like environmental impact assessment. And furthermore, not only impact assessment that are in a relatively like project-based area, but we have now also interpretations by national human rights institutions, which are independent institutions with a constitutional mandate often, to how to embed this right to a healthy environment in strategic environmental impact assessments, or that have been conducted human rights impact assessment. So I think those are some of the benefits that brings. And I think all this discussion was really catalyzed also in terms of the lead up to this recognition by the Human Rights Council.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to another question from Gitanjali Balkrishna. What is one key aspect of water governance which is or can be significantly impacted by recognition of the right to a healthy environment? How far does the right to a healthy environment necessitate preventive action related to risk reduction, related to droughts? David, do you think this is something for you? So key aspects of water governance, which is or can be significantly impacted by the recognition of the right to a healthy environment.
Well, droughts is not really my field, but I do think that, and as we have heard repeatedly here also, that marginalized groups, I would say that, for example, subsistence fishing communities, for example, people struggling to have access to water, etc., and also people living in legal systems that are not as, should you call it, mature and dense as, for example, we find in most of Europe and North America, for example. So where there is more need for courts and agencies to reach for new concepts and new ideas to fill out and to sort of operationalize objectives that may not be concretely or fully developed within their legal systems. I think those are areas where this right will have the most impact. And I think also that's somehow evidenced by the examples that we've heard here today. So I think definitely there is a huge potential for this right in various aspects of water governance, but droughts in particular, that's not my expertise.
Sure, that's fine. This almost makes me think that we need quite progressive judges, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe they actually, they are looking for, they're reaching for these types of approaches and this type of tool to help them in their work.
I think in many instances that is the case, yes. And I've been surprised on many occasions by how progressive judges can be. I mean, when
happily surprised, I guess.
Yes.
Depending on your context, of course.
Of course.
From Lenka Krukova, in the context of development programs, would the panelists have suggestions on ways forward for local CSOs to link their WASH-related work to this right to a healthy environment in practice? With the adoption of this right by the Human Rights Council, would the approach be different than linking WASH to environmental law as such? Amanda, is this something possibly for you, or Anna-Lisa, who would like to take this?
I'm happy for somebody else to take it, actually. I didn't quite catch the beginning of your statement.
Sure. Anna-Lisa, are you happy to say something about?
I'm not sure I actually understand the question, to be honest. So I'm not sure I can help there.
So suggestions and way forwards for local CSOs to link WASH-related work to the work on the right to a healthy environment in practice. This is very much what we are intending to talk about in the next webinar. So maybe we'll save this, Lenka.
I can give you an answer on that. I didn't quite catch what you said. Yeah, I think that it's very much around the human rights-based approach again. It's about awareness, it's about getting communities involved, and for local CSOs, NGOs, people working in the community, it's about helping them to understand the connection between how they look after their water resources and the environment and their own health and their own rights to water. There is a strong connection, and I think certainly Indigenous communities have a lot of that or knowledge already there, but there's also an awful lot of communities that just can't see the big picture. So it gives them ownership over the control of their future water resources.
I'm going to jump to the last question now, and maybe Christina or Anna-Lisa can take this one. We'll see. For populations in urban areas, it seems like the access to green areas and water bodies is shrinking drastically. For example, in Bolivia, where I work, the urban expansion is not prioritizing this access. Rivers are, for example, covered and roads are built on top, and every single green space is squeezed out to construct buildings. How can the human rights to healthy environment compete with these strong development interests?
Yep, happy to take that.
Yeah, great. Go ahead.
So I think this is exactly why we need the right to a healthy environment to be properly considered in decision making and in the law enforcement process. Right now, these decisions are being taken without taking into account the rights and interests of those affected by decisions such as the one that Kim describes. And this really must come to an end. We are all in the race to net zero, to stop biodiversity loss, and all these things simply must stop.
Yeah.
And we can use the right to a healthy environment to make that happen.
Yes.
And I can say from a business perspective, I mean, this would of course mean in general all, the respect to human rights, that whenever, for instance, you want to do a new establishment, and if you go into an area where maybe there's a water outlet or something like that, then maybe you cannot put your factory or distribution center or whatever in that exact location. You need to do more in-depth evaluation of the pros and cons, including the human rights for this specific new one, but also for all the others. So I think that it is to take that in. That's what I meant before. We need to look into all of our work processes and decision-making forums, that how can we actually make decisions that are endorsed by the many and by the different needs.
Thank you so much. And that's all we have time for today. And we hope that you enjoyed this webinar as much as I have, all of us behind the scene have. So we at SIWI, Swedish Waterhouse, and Sida, thank you for joining us today. We thank very much speakers and panelists. Join us for the follow-up webinar, which we are planning on practical aspects and implementation of the right to a healthy environment. So see you next time, and do take the survey that follows once you close your web browser. Bye and stay safe.